Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Patriot Underground. Today is Monday, June 14th, 2021. And tonight I am bringing you part one of my next series on Preston Nichols' book, The Montauk Project, which I believe is one of the most fascinating stories I have ever read, and you will see why. But before we get started, I wanted to thank you, the audience, for stopping by to listen and lend your consciousness to the process of our collective discovery. I appreciate each and every one of you tremendously, and I am eternally grateful for your support. And on that topic, I just wanted to let the audience know that I'm going to be pre-releasing certain episodes, starting with this one, on Patreon for early access for those who have made a monthly pledge. Now, I want to make sure that people don't misunderstand. All of my podcasts will remain free to listen on all major platforms like BitChute, Rumble, and YouTube. What this is an early release of a day or two for my patrons. And the reason I'm doing this is because I feel compelled to give back to those who have been financially supporting my efforts to expand the platform. And this is my way of saying thank you. So if you want to get early access to my content and you also want to contribute to my vision, please consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month to unlock exclusive audio streams ahead of their debut elsewhere. My hope is that folks who are already patrons will appreciate the gesture and that this might incentivize others in the audience to sign up as well, knowing that they're getting early access in return as a token of my gratitude. So thank you all so much, and God bless. Now, before we get into the book, I wanted to mention that I have some more high-profile guest breaking news. So last night I got up around 2:30 in the morning just to get a drink of water, and I glanced over at my phone to see that I had a notification. And I looked, and of course it was a new email. So I opened it up, and I received a response from David Icke that he is interested in coming on the broadcast for an interview. And then, of course, I couldn't fall back asleep, much the same way I couldn't the first time I heard back from Gene, which coincidentally was also in the middle of the night. And of course, on that night, I got absolutely no sleep at all. I thought I was dreaming. And this was just yet another example. I mean, most of you, I'm sure, know David's work. He's a household name all over the world for his vast body of work dating back over 30 years, exposing the cabal and their plan to implement the New World Order. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, this guy he's been at this longer than Alex Jones, and he is just as well known. So this is a high honor indeed. So with every passing day, because of your efforts and your support in large part, the podcast is continuing to expand its reach and get the attention of some very interesting people. So I can't wait to bring you that interview along with the others on the horizon, which I've mentioned recently, including Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, of course, Kerry Cassidy. I'm still waiting to hear back from Kerry to nail down a time. And of course, the return of Gene Decode, which I hope will be in August sometime. So some very exciting conversations to listen to and to look forward to. And we're just getting started. We're just getting warmed up here. And with God's help and blessing, we'll continue to expand this digital family together. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, many of you know some basic information about the Montauk Project, as I did, but perhaps you would benefit from hearing a narration and analysis of the details and significance of this secret program, one that's most of the general public has absolutely no clue about, in my experience anyway. Now, this is a story that involves technology that a vast majority of people have no awareness of. And if they do, of course, they associate it with Hollywood, with fiction. And as we talked about in the series on Agent Buried Alive, that's exactly what they're supposed to think. It's part of the mind control. But most people have no awareness of this technology, and this technology has actually been weaponized against humanity as another attack vector in the elite's arsenal of silent weapons, which, of course, dovetails nicely with the other series that I'm doing on that text, which is, of course, Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. But the info that you're going to learn about is directly connected to the topics of mind control, electromagnetic field manipulation, teleportation, stealth technology, of course, and time travel. And there's more, but that's just a sampling of what's on the buffet. All right. And all of these things that I just mentioned are not only possible, but have been going on for decades, unbeknownst to the public. So, to learn the truth about what happened at Montauk is to begin to understand a very important element of the history of how the elite have been covertly conspiring against us, manipulating and hiding advanced quantum physics from the public, and plotting their breakaway civilization, as we've documented in some detail. So this is a great, great text, and I believe, and if you haven't read it, you should definitely read it. And I believe it's eventually going to be taught in schools all over the world in the wake of the Great Awakening, as people discover this enormously significant story, which illustrates not only that which is possible, but also the lengths to which the elite went to hide the truth of scientific discovery in order to plot against us and to keep us in the dark. Okay, so let's get into the text. So, of course, the book begins with an introduction. And for those of you who don't know, the author, Peter Moon, but along with Preston Nichols, of course, Preston tells us that Montauk Point, where this book is taking place, is located on Long Island. And on the topic of the book, of course, all of these strange incidents happened surrounding an Air Force base, which, although abandoned in 1969, subsequently reopened without the sanctioning of the U.S. government. I mentioned a second ago the authors, I should say, Preston Nichols and Peter Moon, explain that the financing for the base is a mystery to the public. It can't be traced to the U.S. government, can't be traced to the military. Now, the Montauk Project was actually the direct result of what was discovered and observed on the USS Eldridge during the Philadelphia experiment in 1943, which we will discuss in some detail. Now, the Philadelphia experiment, which took place at the Philadelphia shipyard, was known at the time as the Rainbow Project to those who were involved. And originally, the Rainbow Project was top secret, as you would expect. It was a top secret project that was being conducted for military applications, specifically to help end World War II. And actually, the Rainbow Project was the origin of stealth technology. They were experimenting with how to make a ship invisible to enemy radar, and they were successful, as I'll talk about. And they did this by creating what's called an electromagnetic bottle around the ship, which actually diverted radar waves around the ship. So what this electromagnetic bottle does is to alter the entire electromagnetic field of a specific area. And in this case, it was around the Eldridge. But it turned out that the researchers got a whole lot more than they bargained for, because the ship not only became invisible to the naked eye and to radar, but it also was entirely removed from the space-time continuum and reappeared suddenly in Norfolk, Virginia. Now, the Rainbow Project was both a success and a failure. Yes, they were able to make the ship invisible, but what happened to the souls on board the Eldridge was like something out of a horror film. They discovered the crew completely disoriented when the ship disappeared from the space-time continuum because they had departed from the physical universe. and were left with no familiar surroundings and quite literally lost their minds. And when the ship reappeared in Norfolk, some of the crew were found wandering around aimlessly, and their minds were in a total state of horror and disorientation. And other members of the crew had become, quote unquote, integrated into the ship itself. And yes, we're talking about their body parts having melded with the bulkhead, but more about that later. So from that standpoint, this was an unmitigated disaster. And because of this disaster, the crew were declared mentally unfit, and they ended up in asylums. And this, of course, this was done with the aim of discrediting their story to maintain operational secrecy. And additionally, the Rainbow Project, the book tells us, was brought to a halt in favor of the Manhattan Project. And most of you, of course, have heard of that, which was the development of the atomic bomb, which was used ultimately to end World War II, as we know. But what happened after World War II in the late 40s was a reboot of the Rainbow Project to conduct further research into the findings of the strange occurrences on board the Eldridge. And the research endeavor was at that point rebranded as the Montauk Project and culminated, quote, with a hole being ripped in the space-time continuum at Montauk in 1983, end quote. Now in chapter 2, the author of the book, again, Preston Nichols, provides some background information and explains how he was to become involved in one of the most significant research experiments ever conducted that, again, hardly anyone knows about. After going to work for a defense contractor on Long Island, which he refers to as BJM, which is a fictitious name, Preston Nichols began to research telepathic communication in an endeavor to disprove it. Actually, at first, he didn't believe that telepathy and telepathic communication was possible. He set out to disprove it. And surprisingly, he soon discovered that it did, in fact, exist. And he observed in his experimental process that telepathic waves, which are essentially thought waves, not only exist, but behave in a similar manner to radio waves. However, despite the similarity between the two, telepathic waves had some different properties than normal electromagnetic waves. So he set out to discover what they were, thereby beginning his journey into metaphysics. So in his spare time, Nichols began collaborating with psychics to test and to monitor their responses. And he soon discovered that a strange phenomenon was occurring. Every psychic that he worked with got, quote unquote, jammed up every single day at the same hour. They couldn't think or envision effectively as they normally could. Every day for an hour at the same time. So using his radio equipment, he discovered that whenever a 410 to 420 megahertz cycle appeared in the airwaves, the psychics were jammed. And then after the signal was shut off, their normal abilities then returned. They were restored about 20 minutes later. So naturally, he set out to track where this signal was coming from. And to do this, he placed a modified TV antenna on the roof of his car and started driving around looking for the signal using a VHF receiver. And VHF stands for very high frequency. Using this VHF receiver, he looked for the source of these mysterious cycles. Where were these waves coming from? And he tracked them directly to Montauk Point. And he says, quote, it was coming from a red and white antenna on the Air Force Base. And upon further investigation, not only did he find, he also he found and discovered that the mysterious signal was not only coming from the Air Force Base, but it was coming from a World War II era Sage radar that was completely antiquated at that point. And so that really piqued his interest. Why were they using it? And security was really tight on the base, so he started to go and look around. And he was told by the guards that the Sage radar was being used by the FAA for aviation experimentation. An explanation which, of course, made no sense to Nichols because there was no known reason at that time that the FAA would require the use of such outdated equipment. So he didn't believe their explanation, and even though he didn't believe it, there was little he could do to look into it further at that point. He essentially hit a dead end. But he found himself deeply intrigued by the apparent secrecy on the base. And this all occurred, by the way, in 1974. And it wasn't until 10 years later that Preston Nichols got a call from a friend informing him that Montauk Air Force Base had been abandoned. And so once again, he returned to the base to investigate. And when he got there, he observed debris everywhere and open doors and gates. And he determined very quickly that this was not consistent with how the military would vacate a facility under normal circumstances. Very, very unusual. What caught his eye was all of the high voltage equipment, some of which he wanted to buy, being the radio enthusiast that he was. So eventually, through a series of communications, he learned that nobody, neither the military nor the government, claimed the equipment, which he also found quite unusual because this was very expensive, hard to find equipment. And he was given permission to look around the base shortly thereafter, which is where his journey of discovery really took off. And there he met the caretaker of the facility, who showed him around with a psychic named Brian. Brian, of course, came along with Preston Nichols. And he was told by the caretaker that he was not only, he said that he was allowed only one visit, and that if he returned, he would be removed from the property. And strangely, however, the man also said that he goes out for a drink every night at 7. So it seemed to Nichols that the man wanted him to come back and to continue his investigation because, of course, he was telling him he wasn't going to be there every night at the same time. So then as he's wandering around the base, he encountered a man who appeared to be homeless, who told him he'd been living in the building ever since it had been abandoned. And here's where it gets really crazy. The man said something that Nichols found very strange. So strange that he wrote it off as nonsense. The man said that a year earlier, there had been an experiment at the facility that had gone horribly wrong. And he also spoke of a huge beast which appeared and scared everybody away. And what was even stranger than that was that this man recognized Preston Nichols. He told them that he had been a technician at the base who had gone AWOL and that Nichols was his boss. Now, Preston had no idea who he was, and he assumed the man was just crazy, but ultimately, it marked the beginning of his discovery that the Montauk Project was real. So at this point, after this interaction ended, Nichols returned to find Brian, the psychic, who was complaining that things weren't right and he felt some strange vibrations emanating from the base itself. And intrigued by this strange experience, Preston Nichols decided to ask Brian for a psychic reading right then and there. And to his surprise, Brian's reading was almost identical to what the homeless man was saying. He spoke of extremely irregular weather patterns, mind control experiments, and a vicious beast. He said all the same things that the homeless man said, and hadn't been there, by the way, when the homeless man said it. And a few weeks later, the situation got even more uncanny when a stranger barged into Nichols' lab and claimed that he was his boss at Montauk, and then began to detail many technical aspects of the project, and in the process corroborated both the homeless man's story as well as Brian's psychic reading. So after these experiences, Preston Nichols was absolutely convinced that something significant had gone on at the Air Force Base and that his personal involvement was evident. And therefore, of course, he decided to further his investigation. So he camped out on the beach for about a week on Montauk Point and began talking to anyone he could find to get more information. And several people spoke of strange weather patterns, snowfall in the middle of August, as well as other strange weather patterns that had never before been recorded, completely unheard of. And there were other strange stories as well, including animals storming the town en masse and crashing through windows. And by this time, Nichols had begun to bring other psychics out to the Air Force Base with him to do additional readings. And their readings corroborated Brian's, as well as the details Preston had been getting and gathering from other townspeople. And so then he decided to interview Montauk's chief of police, who also reported strange 2-hour incidents where a bunch of crimes would be reported. And then all of a sudden it would go quiet again. And by the way, Montauk is at this point in time, was a very, very quiet and sleepy town. It was not a big tourist attraction or anything. It was a very quiet, sleepy town. Or you would say that a group of teens would suddenly congregate for 2-hour periods and cause mayhem and then mysteriously disperse without any logical explanation other than the time frame. And the chief's statements lined up perfectly with what the psychics were saying about mind control experiments. So the puzzle was expanding, and the pieces at this point were everywhere. And then in November of 1984, a man named Duncan Cameron appeared at Preston Nichols' lab door requesting help with some radio equipment. And quickly, Duncan became involved in Preston's group of psychics, trying to ascertain more information about what transpired at Montauk. And Duncan seemed to possess a high degree of aptitude and was extremely enthusiastic about the endeavor, so much so that he seemed too good to be true. And even Brian became suspicious. Brian, the other psychic, became suspicious of Duncan. And so much so that Duncan's presence caused him to leave altogether. And then one day, Preston surprised Duncan with a trip to Montauk Air Force Base. He took him out there and he told him he was going to take him there to see if he recognized anything. And to Preston's astonishment, Duncan was an absolute expert. He knew the layout and the purpose of each area like the back of his hand. He even knew what his own function was or had been when he was there. And then Duncan entered the transmitter room. And when that happened, he slipped into a trance or a trance-like state. And he began spitting out information to the point where Nichols had to start shaking him in order to break the trance. It was so intense. And when they returned to Preston's lab, they employed some techniques, I think, that he had learned, some techniques that Preston Nichols had learned he employed to attempt to unblock Duncan's memories, which led to layers and layers and layers of programming coming out of him. A lot of it concerning the Montauk Project. And of course, again, this is very consistent with what we learned from the book Agent Buried Alive, of how mind control works and the layers of programming. And finally, quote, a shocking program came straight into the awareness of Duncan's conscious mind. He blurted out, that was end quote, he blurted out that he was programmed to go to Preston's lab, to befriend him, and then to kill him before blowing up his lab and destroying all of his work. And Preston recalls that Duncan was even more horrified at this information than he was. And he swore that he would defect from those who programmed him and work with Nichols from that point on to reveal the truth about what happened at Montauk. And upon further work, Preston Nichols discovered that Duncan had been involved in the Philadelphia experiment. He said that he and his brother Edward had served aboard the Eldridge as crew members. So from this point forward, Nichols began to remember details of his involvement with the Montauk Project slowly but surely, and assembled a small team to investigate. And it wasn't long before they discovered that they had, quote, stumbled across one of the highest security projects the country had ever known, end quote. And then he continues, he says, quote, we figured we had better do something fast with this newfound knowledge. If we didn't, we might end up dead, end quote. Okay, folks, so I'm going to stop it here, just a little teaser for you. So hopefully you enjoyed part one of this series. Please let me know in the comments or on Telegram. Of course, I appreciate all of you and love all of you, and we'll pray for each and every single one of you. So I'll be back soon with another report. Thank you so much for listening. God bless. Patriot out.